So good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. Tonight's presentation has 3 sections. I'm sorry, does everyone on Zoom, can you see the presentation?
Make sure I'm sharing the screen to the right people. Yep, there it is. It's coming up now.
Okay.
Here, so we should be good.
So tonight, this presentation has 3 sections. The first section is a fiscal year 23-24 update. So I want to go over some major items that have occurred in this current fiscal year. I think these will describe where we're headed in next year's budget. This won't be an in-depth analysis. It'll be very focused. And really, tonight, I hope you walk away with a few very important notes, and I will present those ideas in section 1. The second section is going over the 24-25 proposed budget. Tonight, I'm going to show you revenues and expenditures by type. We will not be discussing departments. I'm hoping that we can, in the next section, select a date to come back where I will make another presentation focused on different city departments and divisions. Hello?
If anybody can hear me, I'm unmuted.
Did you mean to be, Dennis?
Oh.
Hey, Derek? Headphones. He's got headphones on. All right. Let me step back there real quick to make sure.
Okay.
Because we're recording, so. On the phone. Okay. All right. Is it better now? Okay. Everybody's good.
Okay. Okay, so back to the presentation. So we'll begin with a 23-24 update. We'll move into the 24-25 proposed budget. And then at the end, what we're hoping to do is schedule a budget study session with the city council. We want to do this because it's more efficient. We plan to invite a representative from every department. So we're aiming for the 12th of June, but if that can't work, we're open to selecting other dates. So let's begin with the current fiscal year update. We're going to look at general fund revenues. So if I were to represent general fund revenues by type, you would see a pie chart that looks like this. This pie chart is not very diversified. It represents about $41.5 million of revenues, and about 81% of those revenues come from the category of taxes. The city has multiple tax revenue streams, including property tax, transient occupancy tax or bed tax, and then an other category. These represent roughly 20% of that tax category. Property tax, the great thing about property tax is that it rarely, if ever, goes down. The unfortunate thing is that the growth rates in this category are not exceptional. Though I will note that over the past few years, we have seen above average growth in this category. TOT, or bed tax. TOT did take a large dip back in fiscal year 1920 when businesses were shut down due to the pandemic. But in the following fiscal year, it came back to where it was at the 2 years prior. Since then, we've hovered roughly around 3.3 million. And next year, without any change to our hotel counts, I expect revenues to be relatively flat. So I want to point out that this one piece of this category, sales tax, is by far captures the lion's share of our revenues, not just in this category, but overall. As you can see, about 27 million of that $41 million comes from sales tax. The city has 3 different sales tax revenues. Here's a chart of the history from fiscal year 2021 through the current fiscal year. You can see that between fiscal year 2021 and 21-22, Measure Q, it was a half-cent sales tax, was replaced by Measure H, a 1 1/4 sales tax. Measure H essentially increased sales tax revenue by about $7 to $8 million. Unfortunately, since fiscal year 21-22, sales tax revenues in total have been flat and even down. And in fact, a few weeks ago, I received an update from our consultants, the HDL companies who provide sales tax projections, and they showed that the current fiscal year was actually expected to be even less than what was provided back when we adopted the budget. So if you compare fiscal year 21-22, when we hit that record revenue, we're expecting this fiscal year to be down about $1 million. Sales tax is something that really follows what's happening in the local economy. It's a great indicator of good times and bad times. I wouldn't say this represents a bad time locally, but it does show that things have slowed down in the local economy. We're hoping that over the next couple years that the trends start to turn around and that we start to see increases in this category because it's so vital to the fiscal health of the city. So really the takeaway here is that the general fund's number one revenue stream has been suffering over the past couple years. So to really understand the fiscal health of the city and more specifically the general fund, this is the category that we need to pay attention to. If we were to go into a recession and these numbers were to drop even further, that could put us in a position where we might be facing cuts. I don't believe that's going to happen, but it is a reality that we have to live in. So on the other side of the equation, our expenditures, there is a couple categories that I want to focus on when it comes to costs. So you can see expenses represented as a pie chart. They are a little more diversified, but there is also a big slice of pie that's almost half of what we spend. We spend, in this fiscal year, we're looking at about $41.5 million. It's essentially a balanced budget, and that biggest piece of pie represents personnel. The other category I want to focus on are outside services. So personnel at about 46% of total spending represents about $19 million. This is the biggest and most important piece of the general fund because the general fund provides services. These are expected to grow, and that's because of negotiations. So in this current fiscal year, I've been a part of 2 negotiations with the city bargain groups. That includes the Eureka Police Officers Association, or EPOA, and the Eureka City Employees Association, or ECEA. There is a third group. They are not represented, and typically the unrepresented or management group tends to receive something similar to the two other bargain groups. So because these agreements have been finalized, I can kind of go over the highlights of both agreements. One thing to know is that these new contracts will begin July 1st, 2024, or the beginning of fiscal year 24-25. We're finishing the prior agreement, which began in fiscal year 21-22 in July. All three groups received increases back then, and over the next 3 fiscal years, all staff will receive COLAs of 5% in year 1, 3% in year 2, and 3% in year 3. Most staff will also receive longevity increases of 2% at 5 years, 4% at 10 years, and 6% at 15 years. Currently, staff are receiving 1% at 5 years, 2% at 10 years, and 3% at 15 years. In addition, sworn officers and dispatchers will receive an additional 3% increase as of July of 24. The city felt that this is a category where we need to provide more because of how important it is to retain and recruit personnel in these categories. And then one last note, both the EPOA and the ECEA will no longer contribute 3% of their pay towards the city's CalPERS expense. So we felt that to provide equity across the board, that this condition in both of their contracts should be removed. These came about a number of years ago. There was an exchange for pay increases in return of paying down the city's CalPERS expense. So in some situations, beginning in July of 24, let's say you're a police officer, you should see an increase of roughly 11%, and even more if you have enough longevity. So the next category I want to point out are outside services. The main driver of expenses in this category have to do with Humboldt Bay Fire. We see Humboldt Bay Fire as another department, but technically we have them under contract. That's because the city is in agreement with the Humboldt Fire District number 1 to join forces and to provide fire services beyond city limits into Cutton, Myrtletown, and Humboldt Hill. Humboldt Bay Fire would technically be the second biggest department in the city, second to the police department. They represent about 74% of this category, or the slice of pie, roughly $7 million. So why is this important? Because they are also under or working on an agreement for pay increases. I serve as the JPA's finance director, just like with the city. I am part of that negotiation team. So because it's still in process, I do not want to give too many details, but it will likely, if not certainly, involve or result in pay increases and therefore expense increases. The other thing to note about the JPA is that we are updating the agreement we have with the fire districts. So the fire chief, myself, and a consultant have been looking at the agreement, and most importantly, the cost sharing conditions of this agreement. We did an analysis earlier in the fiscal year to determine what should be the cost share. Currently, the city pays about 65% of the total JPA budget. The district pays about 35%. Through this analysis, we determined that the true cost share should be more or it should be a 60-40 split. But because that is a significant change, that 5% difference to the city will eventually result in a savings of over $500,000 per year. That is a significant change, especially for the district. So we've determined that beginning in 24-25, we will go halfway there. So the city is expected to pay about 62.5% and the district 37.5%. So the good thing about this is that even though costs are expected to increase with the fire JPA, we will see a little bit of savings due to this change in the ratio. So that concludes my current year overview. I think what I would like you guys to walk away with tonight is that the big things to think about when it comes to the city's budget is how is sales tax coming in and what's happening with personnel costs. And I think if you understand both of those trends, you'll better understand what you're seeing in the 24-25 proposed budget. So tonight we're going to look at the city's major funds. That includes the general fund. The general fund is a governmental fund. This is where all the sales tax or all the tax revenue goes. Tax revenue is discretionary, meaning that we get to choose what we use it for. We will also look at enterprise funds. So enterprise funds are a little different than governmental funds. Enterprise funds are essentially business-like operations. Enterprise funds are restricted in terms of how the funding is used. For example, monies generated from water bills must go back into the water fund. Any revenues received for wastewater treatment must go back into the wastewater fund. These funds cannot be commingled, and they cannot be used for things that do not serve their purpose. For example, you can't use wastewater revenues to pay for police personnel or after-school programs. Monies raised through the delivery of water must go back to support that system. And then there's another category of funds that I will discuss. These are considered internal service funds. Essentially, these are cost centers that serve different city departments as well as different funds. That includes equipment operations, IT, government and administration, and facilities. The way these funds recoup their expenses is by charging these funds that generate their own revenues. And in fact, even within this category, these funds charge each other. So for example, the finance department lives in Fund 650. The finance department provides services to equipment operations and facilities. So both of those funds reimburse the Fund 650. And then one more note, because the general fund receives discretionary revenues, it is allowed to subsidize or provide funding to every other fund. So you can use general fund monies to support water or the harbor fund. And you'll see a little bit of that later on in the presentation. So I'll begin with the internal service funds, starting with equipment operations. So equipment operations, this is our motor pool. We have mechanics and people that run our fleet. Where you'll see increases kind of in any fund or any department will really mainly be in the category of personnel. That's because of the negotiations and the pay increases. On top of that, you will also notice that the cost allocation category is going up across the board. The cost allocation is where those expenses from those internal service funds come through. So because we expect costs to go up in the internal service funds, you will notice that the cost allocation category is going up across all funds. We're also seeing the impacts of inflation, both in materials and supplies as well as outside services. For example, in outside services in the equipment operations fund, we are expecting increases to our lease contract with Enterprise. A lot of the city's fleet is on a lease contract, meaning that when you see, F-150s, your standard service trucks, we've made it a commitment to make sure that those are being maintained and up to date. So a lot of times, or over the years, you should see new and better trucks get cycled through because of our contract with Enterprise. Overall, this fund is expected to grow by about 7%, roughly $200,000. The next fund is IT, Fund 630. Again, in IT, you'll notice that both the personnel and the cost allocation categories are really two of the main drivers in increases in this fund. But I will point out that outside services, which includes all of the contracts that we pay for software services, occur. The city is becoming more and more reliant on software products as a way to provide service to the public. And as you can see, we expect those costs to go up by about $55,000 next fiscal year. The next fund is the Government and Admin Fund, 650. This fund includes finance, the city manager's office, HR, economic development, and the city attorney, as well as the council. There is a large increase in personnel costs. That's because we're adding new positions. We've added a deputy city attorney to help us with legal issues, and we are adding 2 new personnel to help create a communications division in our economic development department. You can see here that the rate of change in this category is much higher than what we're seeing on average. About half of that change of $900,000 has to do with those new positions. You can also see that the cost allocation is really driving the other increase in this fund. And then finally, we have facilities. Facilities fund is in charge of maintaining all city facilities. They're really seeing increases across the board, but again, in those categories of personnel and the cost allocation. So overall, almost all of the internal service funds are going up, and they're going up by double digits. So that will have a major impact on the general fund and the enterprise funds. So the next series of funds are the enterprise funds, and we'll begin with the water fund. Here we're going to look at revenues and expenditures. That's because these funds generate their own revenue. In this fund, we only have one category, that is charges for services. In this case, this is the service of delivering water. In the current fiscal year, we saw rate increases for water service. Those have not gone up as much as we expected. This is mainly due to water meters not working properly. The city installed water meters about a decade ago, and the water meters have failed sooner than we expected. So we are doing our best to replace all of the meter hardware in order to make sure that they are reading the meters properly. Unfortunately, this has had a negative effect on revenues. So therefore, we do not expect revenue growth to be exceptional next year, roughly about 1%. On the expenditure side, there's increases really across the board. Personnel due to COLAs, materials and supplies. We're expecting the wholesale water from the municipal water district, those charges to go up. We've seen increases across all material categories due to inflation. When we're looking at outside services, the main drivers in this category have to do with electricity and merchant fees for doing online payments. Again, cost allocation is poised to rise. And then down here, when you're looking at transfers in this fund, those transfers are going into the water CIP fund. So this is where we budget for projects. We've been doing a lot of major projects in the water CIP fund over the past few years. Next year, we expect that to drop down significantly, just because we've been making a lot of effort in this fund. So overall, in the current fiscal year, we're expecting a small surplus, and we're actually expecting another surplus in fiscal year 24-25. Next, we have the wastewater fund. So revenues in the wastewater fund are expected to rise quite a bit. The city is currently replacing a lot of sewer laterals. This is the sewer line that connects your house to the main artery in the street. You are required to replace your sewer lateral if you do a major remodel or if you sell your home. That has driven revenue up by roughly $900,000 in the current fiscal year. We did not expect revenues to increase that much, so it was a nice surprise, and we've identified this new revenue stream in next year's budget. So overall, we're expecting revenues in the wastewater fund to increase by over $1 million. On the expenditure side, we're seeing increases in personnel. In outside services, again, this is due to electricity and merchant card charges, as well as an increase in consulting fees for some studies. Cost allocations going up, and then monies transferred over to the wastewater CIP fund are decreasing by a large dollar amount, but overall not too much. The wastewater fund tends to have many more capital needs than the water fund, just due to the process of treating wastewater versus treating water. It's likely that transfers for projects will go up again next fiscal year and over the course of the next decade. Overall, we expect a relatively large surplus in the wastewater fund, mainly due to those fees for the sewer lateral replacements. Next is the Harbor Fund. The Harbor Fund manages the Wharfinger building, the small boat harbor, as well as a lot of buildings on the waterfront that are used for fish processing or restaurants. This fund receives a number of different revenue types. That intergovernmental revenue comes from the state to pay for old redevelopment debt. That number will stay the same every fiscal year until that debt is paid off. Charges for services. We expect this category to increase due to increases in our rent due to CPI adjustments. And then we've added a couple new lease agreements related to fish processing on the waterfront. This other financing sources category, this is actually monies transferred from the general fund to help ensure that this fund has a balanced budget. On the expense side, personnel costs are going up by more than the average. This is due to an additional employee. Cost allocation is also going up substantially. A lot of times the cost allocation is driven by number of personnel. So when a department increases numbers of personnel, that will increase both the personnel category as well as the cost allocation category, because a lot of things like finance are allocated based on number of employees. Overall, we expect a balanced budget in the Harbor Fund for fiscal year 24-25. Finally, we have the Building Fund as our last enterprise fund. The Building Fund has done really well over the past few fiscal years. We're seeing an increase or gradual increase in building permit fees. What's great about next year is that because of the increase in permit fees, we actually expect the subsidy from the general fund to go away. So that $73,000 in the current fiscal year, that's coming from the general fund to balance their budget. But because of the increase in the other category, we feel that that's no longer necessary. I forgot to add the slide that shows the bottom line, but as you can see, total revenue is about $792,000, and total expenditures are about $793,000. So the Harbor Fund has a balanced budget as well. Last but not least, we have the General Fund. So we'll begin with that same category that I showed you before, taxes. This category is expected to go down by about $205,000. Based on the size of this category, that's not a significant change, but it is unfortunate because this is the category that we rely on the most. In this intergovernmental category, this includes monies that we receive from grants. The city has hired some personnel for mental health services. These personnel are funded from outside monies through grants. We expect a large increase in this revenue because of this personnel. So that's why there's an assumption that we're going to see about $1 million more in grant revenue in the general fund next fiscal year. Charges for services. So the main driver in this category has to do with the Sequoia Park Zoo. We expected revenues from the zoo to go down this fiscal year, but they continue to exceed expectations. Both admission fees and membership revenues are expected to gross over $2 million from the zoo. That is a large feat, given that back in fiscal year 18-19, we only received about $400,000 from zoo operations, and today that number is over $2 million. And then in this category, miscellaneous, this includes interest on cash. The city has been lucky to build up reserves over the past few fiscal years. Right now, we have about $15 million in some investment accounts, making roughly between 4.5% and 5%. I decided to include about $250,000 in interest revenues. That is assuming that we can maintain rates of 4 to 5% at least halfway through the next fiscal year. on the expenditure side, we're expecting about 9% increase, or a 9% increase in personnel costs. In this miscellaneous category, this includes monies that we contribute to different functions, including what we pay for marketing. We're pivoting a little bit next fiscal year with this new communications division. So we do expect to save some money on what we spend for outside marketing services. So this is one category that's actually expected to go down. Cost allocation, this in the general fund is very significant and is expected to increase by almost 1.2 million. And then debt service. So the city, even though we are paying for fire services through the JPA, the city maintains control of fire facilities and fire equipment. So a couple years ago, we purchased a new ladder truck that should be delivered any day now, and we're expecting debt service payments to increase next fiscal year due to acquiring that new apparatus. Transfers. This category includes monies we spend on street infrastructure. The city spends about $2.5 million per year from the general fund on streets. That is going to be maintained in next year's budget. We're reducing what we're spending on facilities. In 23-24, that was about $875,000. Next fiscal year, that's about $500,000. And then, as you notice in the building fund, we're not paying for that subsidy, so we're actually going to save some money in this category. Unfortunately, we expect a deficit in the general fund in fiscal year 24-25 of about $1.1 million. This is something that we're going to have to monitor. We do budget fairly conservatively. I don't actually expect the deficit to be that large. It's likely to be about half of that. The good thing is that at the end of fiscal year 22-23, the city had built up reserves by about $8 million from fiscal year 2021. So currently we have about $11.2 million in reserves in the general fund. That represents about 27% of what we spend. It's recommended that we have 15% of expenditures in reserves. So it's important that we correct this issue, but it is not at the moment a cause for concern, but something that we need to work on before it does become something that could result in budget cuts. So this is to be continued. I'm hoping that we can come back and essentially show the numbers again, but by department and division. So I'm hoping right now we can select a study session date. What will be presented at the study session? Again, it'll be budgets by department and division, as well as a Measure H analysis. Who will be there? We're hoping that we'll have someone from every city department, as well as the Eureka City Council. There's a question mark there because we don't know if the dates will align. But we're hoping that on June 12th, which is 2 weeks from now, that we can reconvene and meet at the same time with both the city council and the departments. So I'd like to open it up to questions and comments, but first let's talk about if this date works for everyone or if there's another time that we can meet to go over more budget information.
Sorry, you're in us.
I can make June 12th work, but that's not a real meeting.
Yeah, but it's recording, so.
I could make June 12th work. I'd prefer a different date,
Okay.
but I could make it work. I have something else that I would have to cancel, but June 5th is open and June 19th, but that's a holiday, so I probably wouldn't meet on that date.
Do you want me to ask Dennis?
Yeah, let's ask.
Dennis, are you available to talk about dates?
There we go. Yeah, any would be fine for me. And then I had one question too I wanted to ask Lane.
Go ahead.
Lane, it concerns grants. I think last year you were telling us that some of the projects like bulb outs and so forth were grant related.
Mm-hmm.
Do the grants show up in the revenue and the budget that you showed us?
Tonight, what I showed you guys were operational expenses.
Okay.
So in the future, and likely at the study session, I would go over projects, which would include things like the bulb outs and those expenses.
Okay, thank you.
What's up for staff? It's here, but
Was
I don't know what happened.
were there, or James, any questions? We'll get back to the dates, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a question on the wastewater fund. So sewer lateral replacement brings in $900,000 in revenue, but where's the corresponding expense that the sewer lateral costs? And are we seeing that in there as well, or is that a true, real $900,000 revenue?
Great question. So how I would answer that is, so there's two sections of your sewer lateral. There's the section on your property, and then there's the section that's in the street. You're required to replace or deal with the replacement of the section that's on your property, but you technically own the section that's in the city's right of way. So what happens is someday the city will come through and replace that second section when they tear up the street. We are currently doing that, but we're not necessarily doing that in the place where the person paid what's called an in lieu fee. So, right. So those monies transferred from the operating fund to the CIP fund are actually covering that bigger project where we're going around the city and replacing that second half of the lateral. So it's not that it's necessarily extra money, but I don't think we expected, or at least I didn't expect to see revenues get generated by that much that quickly. So it will be something that is paid for in the future, but right now it's actually providing us with a surplus. So, yeah.
And then I had another question around, and maybe this is me. Maybe I don't fully understand what cost allocation is, but so I'll just give you my understanding. So, like, for example, government and admin, right? That whole portion of staff and personnel are doing work for other funds, essentially, for other departments or teams or however you want to classify them. So, like, the personnel that are in wastewater are paid by staff that exist in government and admin. And so you have like a cost allocation for the work that's done, or help me understand what cost allocation is, and then maybe that'll answer my question as to why there would be cost allocations in government and admin fund 650.
Yeah, let me go back to the finance department because I think it's one of the easiest to understand. So let's think about payroll. So rather than having and some agencies actually do this, so rather than having a payroll person in every department, like a police payroll and Parks and Rec payroll, That's unnecessary because we only need a couple people to run payroll. So that payroll function is captured in that fund 650. And then you determine, okay, well, if I have 2 people running payroll for all these different funds and all these departments within the fund, well, how do I make sure to spread those costs out equitably? So in that sense, the most, I think, logical way to cost allocate those expenses would be number of personnel. Like if the police department has 80 employees, that's 80 paychecks. If personnel has 6 people, that's 6 paychecks. So you take, use that as your cost driver. So you keep those payroll costs in this internal service fund, and then when you look at a department's budget and you see this category of cost allocation, there's actually a number of different line items, whether it's admin or equipment operations or IT. You can say, oh well, how is the city paying for this IT service, or how's the police department getting IT service? Well, it's through the city's IT department, and that's showing up in their budget under this cost allocation category. It's the most unlike section of everyone's budget because they don't control it. So it's kind of just provided to them, but it does show up, like, if you increase your staff by quite a bit, you're going to pay for it in that cost allocation category.
So like in government and admin, the cost allocations that could show up in there would be related to facilities and information technology and equipment operations, plus maybe a little bit of, like, for example, that payroll staff that exists. Because to me, that almost seems like double dipping, or like, right? Because it's like, if you're in government and admin, why would you cost allocate to government and admin?
No, that's a great question. So because I have to use some features of Excel to allow me to do what's called a circular reference.
Right.
And you are essentially doubling expenses in a way. The government and admin fund doesn't charge internally.
Right.
So if you look in that fund, you wouldn't see any government or admin charges, but you would see facilities and equipment operations. And in equipment operations, they're not, even though they have their own vehicles, it just doesn't, it becomes too much of a math equation to do it that way. So
then why don't we see like a corresponding offset in equipment and operations or government and admin for that cost allocation coming into them, right? Like if you're cost allocating part of the personnel expenses for government and admin to facilities, you're charging an expense to facilities. But to my mind, there'd be like a corresponding income into government and admin. You see what I'm saying? Or no?
No.
I might not be thinking of it right, which I admit.
It's almost best explained by showing you the model that I create. But
okay.
Yeah, I think if you looked at the line item budget, you'd notice, facilities doesn't charge them, or there's a line item that says facility operations, and that would be 0 in that fund. If you saw the government and admin fund, if expenses increase in that fund, then when you look at the facilities budget and you look at that government or that admin line, you expect an increase relative to how much that fund is growing.
Right.
There's some cities will essentially put these keep these functions within the general fund, and then the general fund will allocate out that overhead into the enterprise funds.
Got it.
You're not on Zoom anymore, but I still am. So that's it. We've got.
Well, we
staff
should
members.
select a date, so the 12th is a no-go. Yeah. The council hasn't responded to that date, so let's maybe wait till the end of the week, and then we'll update the committee with what the final decision was, because it's not a guarantee. that it will occur on the 12th. So maybe let's give it a couple days and then we'll make some decisions via email. Either way, I think it would be good if we can get a quorum and go over this section or the second half of the budget. I just want to make sure if I'm inviting representatives from every department that we have enough people here. So, yeah.
Lane, a quick question on protocol. I thought when they offered the Zoom that would still count as a quorum, but it doesn't. You have to be there in person, correct?
We can make exceptions. I think we just had to. You have to know beforehand to make sure that that's allowed.
Okay.
I think for
Sorry.
tonight it didn't matter, but
Okay.
for the study session, I will absolutely make sure that that's something that can be accommodated.
Okay. Sorry, James, you were there all by yourself.
That's okay.
So if I'm still here, available for questions, or we can just wait until next time.
Can I just share one thing?
Yeah.
It can wait until we do the formal motion on the minutes, but since it hasn't happened yet, the meeting last year took place on June 7th, not May 7th.
Okay.
And so before we approve the minutes, if we don't do it before then, I'll make the formal motion during the next meeting to correct them. But
Okay.
that's just one thing I caught.
Good catch. Thank you.
Good cat. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you two for coming and listening to me. So
Good presentation, Lane. Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Well, have a good night, and we will talk soon.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.